And within local press in Bahrain as well, but it's not quite as flattering. So, Maryam, please.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to the Cairo Institute for, as always, putting attention to Bahrain at the Human Rights Council. I wanted to start today by giving you a brief update of the situation on the ground inside Bahrain, provide you with a few numbers of what's going on. The Bahrain Center for Human Rights, as you know, has been documenting the human rights violations that have been occurring in Bahrain for many, many years now. It was set up in 2001. But to talk about recent events, in the month of August, the BCHR documented approximately 150 arrests. The number was much larger than that. I'm not counting the arrests of people who were arrested and then released, but rather just people who were arrested and continue to be imprisoned. Amongst them were 15 children under the age of 18 and 1 woman. We've also documented 400 house raids in the month of August. House raids are usually conducted by masked men in civilian clothing who are backed by security forces. They tend to break down the door of the house, the front door, or go through the roof. In Bahrain, of course, the ceiling or the roof is flat and there's an entrance into the house from the top. And so they'll jump on top of the roof from a neighboring house and then enter the home through that way. And usually during these house raids, there is no warrant presented. They terrorize the people living in that house. Some people sometimes get beaten. We have had women who have been subjected to sexual assaults during house raids. And they also tend to steal valuables like gold, money, anything else they can find, and seize electronic devices. In the month of August, we've also documented at least 50 injuries, mostly of pellets and tear gas. We actually have a video of a riot police officer telling other officers with him to aim for the protesters' heads. The pellets, of course, the pellet shotgun has been one of the main reasons or causes of death in Bahrain during protests. During the year of 2013, or to be more specific, since mid-February until now, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights has documented at least 1,220 arrests so far. And of course, that number is smaller than the actual number because of our limited capacity in documenting everything that's happening. The majority of those cases, people are subjected to enforced disappearance. This happens between 10 hours to sometimes up to 2 weeks since their arrest, where they have absolutely no contact with lawyers or families. When the families ask about them at police stations or at the public prosecution or at the Central Intelligence Department, where the people are usually taken, they deny having them in their custody. Or they refer them to someone else who refers them to someone else who refers them to someone else, and it keeps going that way. And then usually when the person surfaces from the enforced disappearance, we find out that they've been held at the Central Intelligence Department, the CID, and most of the times they've been subjected to ill treatment that amounts to torture at most times, because it is used to force them to sign confessions. To give you an example of that, we have a human rights defender, Naji Fatil, who was arrested in May and is being tried on terrorism charges. Of course, the terrorism law in Bahrain has been internationally criticized and condemned for being too vague. Even the activities of a human rights defender can be identified as terrorism under the terrorism law in Bahrain. He was arrested, and according to, of course, he was subjected to enforced disappearance, and when he resurfaced, we found out, or we received credible reports that he was subjected to torture, including, but not limited to, electric shocks and waterboarding and severe beatings. He was then taken to the public prosecution, and I'm giving you this example to also show the role of the public prosecution in these cases. He was taken to the public prosecution, where he was told by the public prosecutor that he either signs the confession that he has committed these crimes, or he will be sent back to the CID until he is ready to sign the confessions. This is something that is recurring. It's not something that is specific to this case. We've documented many cases of this happening, and not only to adults, but also to children. Recently, actually just last week, 15 boys were swimming in a swimming pool when it was raided by security forces. All of them were arrested, and now they're all being charged under the terrorism law. The youngest one is 15 years old. One of them, Zakaria, actually has only one kidney, and his other kidney is not healthy, and he's suffering from serious health problems. His family has made several appeals to the prison administration with no avail. unfortunately. And this has been the case, to move us on to the next point, this has been the case for many political prisoners. Most political prisoners do not have access to adequate medical care. One case, Mohammed Sahwan, who was arrested actually in 2011 and continues to be in prison today, has around 80 pellets in his head and neck. He's been suffering from these pellets that have not been removed, and he is being denied adequate medical care. A few weeks ago, he had a cold, and so because of the continuous sneezing, his family have told us that some of the pellets moved, and now he's suffering from severe pain in his ear. Again, requests for him to be taken to the hospital have not been addressed by the prison administration. Maryam Al-Khawaja, who's a human rights activist in Bahrain, and being held in prison since February and will be held until next February on several cases, if it's not further extended, is being held with two cellmates who have hepatitis A and hepatitis B. Her family have made several requests that she be vaccinated because she's at risk of getting those contagious diseases, of course with no avail with the prison administration. She has yet to be vaccinated from getting hepatitis. And of course she's worried because her 4-year-old daughter visits her in prison, and she's worried that she might pass it on to her family members. Which again brings me to my next point, which is impunity and accountability. The person in charge of addressing these requests and complaints from the families and the prisoners is Ibrahim Al-Ghaith. Ibrahim Al-Ghaith is the prison inspector, and he's responsible for many of these violations. He is actually a part of the delegation sent from Bahrain to the Human Rights Council, and according to our knowledge, he's here in Geneva making visits and meetings with different delegations here. It is very, very concerning that Bahrain feels comfortable enough to send human rights violators to the Human Rights Council to lobby on their behalf. Another person who has also been involved in serious allegations is Salah Ali, who is currently the Minister of State for Human Rights and who is also currently in Geneva lobbying on behalf of the Bahraini government. Salah Ali was mentioned in the Bandar Gate report, which was released several years ago. The Bandar Gate report was information and documentation that was revealed by an advisor to the Prime Minister, Salah al-Banda, and he basically revealed that there was a secret cell that existed within the Bahraini government that basically worked towards creating polarization within the Bahraini community between the Sunni and the Shia sects, and also worked extensively on marginalization and discrimination against the Shia majority in Bahrain. Salah Ali was one of the people documented in this report, and today he is here in Geneva lobbying on behalf of the Bahraini government. Furthermore, on the subject of accountability and impunity, Bassam al-Ma'raj and Mubarak bin Ahwal are two people who were mentioned in the Human Rights Watch report in 2010 as being involved in torture. There has been no accountability for these two. In fact, Bassam al-Ma'raj has recently been promoted by the king to a new position, higher position. Mubarak bin Ahwal, who there is documented evidence that he was involved in torturing medics in Bahrain in 2011, was acquitted on all charges by the Bahraini court. And to add insult to injury, he was visited by the Prime Minister in his home, and this is all on video on YouTube, you can look it up, where the Prime Minister thanked him for his work and then reminded him that both he himself, the Prime Minister, and Mubarak bin Ahwal are above the law. And this has been the case, of course, for all officers in Bahrain. Moving on to my last point before I sum up, is the law amendments and new decisions. In July, there were several law amendments made that were put forward as recommendations by the National Assembly. The National Assembly, of course, is supposed to represent the people of Bahrain, but their recommendations were about having harsher punishments for people who protest under the guise of terrorism. They called for the revoking of citizenship of people who are accused of terrorism. They called for invoking harsher punishments like the death penalty and life imprisonment for people who, again, are charged with terrorism. And they also called for harsher punishments for people who instigate. Now, they actually word it this way. They say that the instigation doesn't have to actually result in an act of violence. Basically, as a human rights defender from Bahrain, I can write a tweet saying that police officers are, and name, for example, certain people as being responsible for human rights violations, And that can be seen as instigation for an attack on police. And it can be tried under the terrorism law in Bahrain. And that in itself could be an instigation. So like I mentioned, even the work of a human rights defender in Bahrain can be tried under the terrorism law. These amendments were, of course, are nothing new to Bahrain. This is something that's already been happening. Like citizenship, the revoking of citizenship has happened last year, where 31 people were revoked of their Bahraini citizenship. But they're just giving it a new legal face. It's something that's already happened. Of course, they also issued a blanket ban on protests in Manama. Since then, people have defied that new decision and have staged at least 25 different protests in different times since the decision banning all protests in Manama. And the Crown Prince, the Prime Minister, and the King all came out after the recommendations made by the National Assembly and called for the urgent and swift implementation of these recommendations so that they become law. Of course, when talking about attacks on human rights defenders, we're still looking at a situation where the most prominent human rights defenders are still in prison. Nabil Rajab, the president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, continues to be in prison today. He has lost 3 of his family members, including his mother, during his time in prison. Just recently, this week, he lost his uncle, and he was not allowed by the prison administration to attend the funeral. And this is something that has been recurring with other political prisoners as well. Maryam Al-Khawaja, who was mentioned as one of the severest torture cases in the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, continues to be in prison today. We have Maryam Al-Khawaja, Naji Fatih, Mohammed Al-Masqati is on trial. Sayyid Yusuf Al-Muhafdha, who's with us here today, is also has trials that have been put on hold but can be activated at any time. And personally, I tried to travel to Bahrain as a Bahraini citizen in August, and I was denied boarding by British Airways at the request of the Bahraini government. Apparently now, even Bahraini citizens living abroad can be denied from traveling back to their own country by the Bahraini government. And I think that was, in general, everything I wanted to speak about. Recommendations. I think we've already heard the speech of the High Commissioner in the opening statement, which we were very thankful for, of course. And then, of course, the joint statement, which was signed by 47 different countries here at the Human Rights Council. The statement of the High Commissioner mentioned some very important points, namely cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which the Bahraini government has not been doing, and they need to be pressured to respect that relationship with the Office of the High Commissioner and allow the Office of the High Commissioner to open a full mandate office in Bahrain. They need to be pressured, the Bahraini government needs to be pressured to allow visits from the Special Rapporteur on Torture, whose visit has been delayed twice and effectively cancelled by the Bahraini government. The Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Assembly has made a request to visit Bahrain since September 2011, and they have yet to hear back from the government. So these are very simple things that the Human Rights Council can pressure the Bahraini government on doing. Of course, there's the recommendations that were issued by the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, as well as the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review on Bahrain. And the Bahrain government, of course, issued statements saying that they have not only implemented all of the recommendations issued, but they have gone above and beyond in implementing them. We have issued several reports countering that statement and proving with evidence on the ground that that has not been the case. On the contrary, the human rights situation continues to deteriorate. So something that we would recommend is a sort of follow-up session that could look into the implementation of these recommendations here at the Human Rights Council. And then, discussing how it can be taken forward since they have not been implementing the recommendations they have promised to implement. And of course, this session there was another joint statement, like I mentioned, by 47 different countries. And joint statements do have an effect, and they are important. But when you use the joint statements one too many times, they start losing their effects. And I think after this third joint statement here at the Human Rights Council, we have reached a point where we need to move on to something different, because it is obviously no longer working with the Bahraini government. And we are going to work very hard, and hopefully with your support, to call for a resolution next session on Bahrain, to take it one step further and tell the Bahraini government, who thinks that they have international impunity, both at the UN as well as internationally, that is not the case. And double standards do not apply in the Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maryam. Thank you for that overview. again, I think that a lot of us, and in general, I think a lot of us have paid close attention to these country situations for a little while, and then our attention has